On the summit of Mount Olympus, the air is so still that a thread of wool, let go from an open hand, would fall straight down and lie exactly where it landed. Nothing above the cloud disturbs it. There is no weather on that height, no rain and no wind, and the only sound is the faint hiss of the thunderbolt cooling in the palm of Zeus, its edges dulled to the low red of iron that the smith has laid aside. Near him, Poseidon leans upon the trident, and the salt has dried white in the grooves where the 3 prongs are set into the shaft. They are larger than any mortal, untouched by age, and tonight they are entirely at rest. If these ancient stories help you rest, subscribe, so the next story can find you at bedtime. Far beneath that stillness, under the floor of the mountain, and under the sea, and under the roots of both, there is a gate of bronze that has not opened in an age, and behind it the older tenants of this throne sit in the dark. Nobody on the summit speaks of them tonight. These are not forces, and not bare ideas wearing borrowed names. They are persons, and a settled company, a household quiet at last. And yet the quiet has a question folded inside it. How does a dark and formless void give rise to a household of deathless gods who love, quarrel, and rule like an immortal reflection of the mortals who worship them? For now the company holds still, and the light seems to come from the gods themselves rather than from any sun. Hera sits in her authority beside Zeus. Demeter, who tends the growing grain, and Hestia, who keeps the hearth, are present in their quiet strength. The younger ones move among them, Apollo and Artemis, Ares and Hephaestus, Hermes and Athena, and Aphrodite. 12, and the seats are full. At the edge of the light stands one more, Dionysus of the vine, who is not always counted and is never quite absent, the 13th name for a company that has only ever had 12 places. Each of them carries a portion of the world in the way a mortal might carry a single thought. Look closely at any one of them, and the first mark of their difference is hidden inside the body. Where a mortal carries blood, warm and quick to spill, the veins of these figures carry something else, a bright fluid the poets named Ichor. It is produced by what they consume, by the fare of the immortals rather than the bread and wine of mortal tables, and it is this substance, more than beauty or size, that sets them apart from everything that lives and dies below. Ichor does not age the body that holds it. It halts the slow turning by which flesh ripens, weakens, and fails. A god reaches a certain fullness of form and then remains there, held at the height of strength, while the generations of mortals rise and wither like leaves beneath the mountain. This is the fixed marker, the one trait that cannot be taken from a god without unmaking him. A god may be wounded, may be deceived, may be shamed or bound or driven from a battlefield, and remain a god still, so long as death has no claim on him. And because they do not die, their story does not end. It only deepens, layer upon layer, reaching back through parents and grandparents to the very first condition of things. Behind Zeus, whose reign now holds the cosmos in its present shape, stands his father Cronus, who ruled before him and swallowed his own children as each of them was born. Behind Cronus stands Uranus, the sky, brought down by a hidden blade in the hand of his own son. And behind the first parents, there stands no parent at all, only the dark from which the earliest powers arose, unmade and unmothered. Between that darkness and this summit lie 3 kings, 2 mountains, and a war that ran 10 years without a single death in it. The Greeks kept the whole of it as a descent, a line of parents and children running unbroken from the first emptiness to the seat where Zeus now sits. And to tell it is to say how the world came to be ordered as they believed they found it. What kind of beings were they, these persons on the height? They were anthropomorphic through and through, shaped like human beings, in body and in feeling, yet raised far above the human measure in every dimension. They knew vastly more than mortals knew. They saw across distances no eye could span, and remembered ages no memory could hold. And still, for all that knowledge, their inner lives mirrored the lives of the people who told of them. They felt jealousy and desire. They loved and betrayed and forgave and struck out in anger. They were, by the honest reckoning of the tradition, amorous and often amoral, moved by appetite and pride as readily as by justice, and they were said to speak among themselves in a language of their own, distinct from the speech of mortals, as though even their words belonged to a higher order. Their power was not abstract either. It reached down into the ordinary world and touched the things a farmer or a sailor or a soldier cared about most. A god could send the rain that saved a harvest, or withhold it until the fields cracked. A god could raise the wind that carried a ship home, or drown that ship beneath a wave. The growing of crops, the coming of sickness that emptied a village, the outcome of a battle where thousands pressed against thousands, the rise or ruin of a city and its leaders, all of these lay within the reach of divine will. Divine attention ran through the whole fabric of the world, as thread runs through cloth, present in every ordinary hour and invisible in all of them, so that the difference between plenty and famine, between a victory and a slaughter, might turn on whether a god had been pleased or slighted. To live well was, in part, to keep the right relation with these persons who could not be seen but could always be felt. And because they were persons, each had to be known and named. A god's identity began with a name, but a name alone was rarely enough, for the same great power might be met in 100 places under 100 aspects. So the name was joined to an epithet, a title or surname that narrowed and clarified whom one addressed. An epithet might mark a function, naming the god as the one who guards the harbor, or the one who brings the light, or the one who guides the traveler on the road. It might mark a tie to another deity, or fix the god to a particular place, a local form worshipped at one sanctuary, and known there by a name a neighboring town might not use. In this way, a single Zeus could be many Zeuses, each honored for a different work, and the worshipper, who who chose the right title, spoke, as it were, to the right face of the god. Beyond the name and its epithet, a god's character was built up from three further sources, each adding depth to the figure the mind could hold. There was cult, the whole body of practice by which mortals reached toward the divine, the sacrifice laid upon the altar, the prayer spoken with lifted hands, the libation poured out upon the ground, the festival that gathered a city into a single act of honor, and the temple raised as a dwelling worthy of a god. There was mythology, the store of stories told of each deity, the deeds and quarrels and unions that gave the name a history and a personality. And there was iconography, the way the gods were shown in art, in painting and carving, and the shaping of bronze, so that even a mortal who could not read might recognize a god by sight. For this last, the artists relied on symbols, objects so bound to a single power that to show the object was to name the god. The thunderbolt belonged to Zeus, a jagged shaft of divine fire that no other hand could hold, and wherever it appeared, the Sky Father was present. The trident belonged to Poseidon, the three-pronged spear of the fisherman raised to the scale of the sea itself, and it marked its bearer as the one who shook the earth and stirred the deep. Such objects worked as a language of the eye, a shorthand by which the crowded company of heaven could be told apart, so that the god at the head of the summit and the god who leaned beside him were known at a glance, each by the sign that only he could carry, and a scene on a cup or a pediment could be read across a room. All of this, the nature and the naming, the cult and the symbol, comes down through a handful of voices who first set the story into lasting words, and without them, the line back to the void could not be traced at all. The oldest and most familiar of these voices is Homer, whose two great poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, took shape in the years around 750 to 700 before our era. The Iliad tells of a stretch of the long war at Troy, and the Odyssey of a single man's return across a hostile sea, and in both the gods move constantly among mortals, taking sides, giving aid, nursing grievances. Yet Homer looks only briefly, and from the corner of the eye, at the world as it stood before Zeus came to rule. His concern is the present age of the gods, their dealings with heroes, and the older order lies behind his verses like a country glimpsed but never entered. For the deeper past, the account turns to another poet of nearly the same years, Hesiod, and to the poem he called the Theogony, the birth of the gods. In its 1022 lines of old epic speech, Hesiod gathered the scattered local traditions of the Greek world and wove them into a single ordered sequence, the first known Greek telling of how the cosmos and its gods came to be. It is cast in the form of a hymn, an offering of praise to Zeus and to the Muses, the daughters of memory who grant song. Hesiod even tells how the gift came to him, describing how the Muses found him keeping his flocks beneath a mountain, set in his hands a shepherd's staff of laurel, and breathed into him a voice of authority, so that he might sing of things that were and things to come. From a herdsman on a hillside, the tradition made the first great orderer of the beginning, the one who dared to set the whole descent of the gods in a single sequence and speak it aloud from end to end. Hesiod did not stand entirely alone in his own age. There were other theogonies, other poems that traced the birth and succession of the gods, composed across the long span from roughly 800 to 4 our era, and ascribed in later memory to famous names, to Orpheus the singer, whose music moved stones, to Musaeus, to Pherecydes, to Epimenides. But these have not survived. They come to later hands only as fragments, as titles, as scattered lines quoted by others, so that their fuller shape is lost. What remains whole, the only such account to reach across the ages intact, is Hesiod's, and so it is his ordering that gives the backbone to the story, his sequence that the later writers of Greece and of Rome would echo and adjust. And that sequence, once followed to its root, does something the ease of the summit does not prepare one for. It begins not with a god enthroned, not with light or law or a father at the head of a family, but with an absence, a dark and yawning openness in which nothing yet had form. To reach that beginning, the mind must let go of the mountain, and the 12 who rest upon it must set aside the thunderbolt and the trident and the bright Ichor in immortal veins, and travel back past every parent and every war to the first condition out of which all the rest would slowly come. Chaos came first. Not a place, not a maker, not a voice speaking across the water, but a dark and indefinite openness, a yawning without edges, in which nothing yet held a shape it could keep. Hesiod names this first condition chaos, and the word does not mean the noise and confusion it has come to carry in later speech. It meant a gap, a gulf, a divine emptiness that was itself a kind of being. From this, the whole of the ordered world would eventually arise, yet the beginning had no order in it at all. There was only the vast and gentle dark, waiting, though it did not know that it waited. The strangeness of such a beginning is quiet and easy to walk past. Many peoples open their oldest stories with a shaping hand, a craftsman who divides light from darkness, or a word that calls the world into standing. The Greek account opens instead with an absence that is somehow alive, a primordial condition counted among the gods, without ever taking a face or a name that could be prayed to at an altar. Chaos does not rule. Chaos does not choose. Chaos is simply the first of all things, the ground beneath the ground, and everything that follows will trace its lineage back into that formless deep. Out of this first emptiness, the primal beings began to appear, not born in the ordinary sense, for there were as yet no couplings, no unions of one god with another, but coming forth as the dark unfolded from within itself. 2 generations of these descendants of chaos are set down in the tradition, and among them stand figures whose names would echo through many other early cosmogonies, in poems now lost and in poems still whispered. There is Nyx, who is night, deep and veiled and endlessly patient. There is Ether, the high, bright upper air, the clear and shining sky that lies above the lower mists where mortals breathe. And there is Eros, not yet the small winged companion of Aphrodite that later art would paint, but an older and greater power, the urge toward union itself, the force by which separate things are drawn together, so that the making of new things becomes possible at all. These were not the only ones. Out of the same gap came Erebos, the thick gloom that fills the hollow places under the world, and Tartarus, the pit itself, counted here not as a punishment, but as a region, a floor laid beneath the floor long before there was any prisoner to put upon it. And when night lay with Erebos, gloom joined to gloom in the first union the story records. The two of them brought forth the pair a waking eye could see, Ether the shining air, and Hemera who is day. It is worth pausing on the order of that, for it runs against the grain of what one expects. Light is not set against the dark as its enemy or its conqueror. Light is the dark's own child, born out of it as a spring is born out of a hillside, so that morning in this reckoning is not a victory over night, but the youngest thing night ever made. Night and the shining air and the drawing together of things belonged, it seems, to the very oldest layer of the story, older than the mountains, older than the sea, older than any throne. They are the powers a person meets without needing to be taught them. The dark that comes down every evening, the clear height that stands above the weather, and the pull that brings one living thing toward another. The Greeks did not have to invent these. They had only to give them parents, and having given them parents, they had begun a genealogy that would not stop until it reached a king. From Nyx, the night, the dark brought forth a strange and sorrowful family. She who had come from chaos went on to produce children of her own, and her progeny were not rivers or winds or bright expanses. They were the dismal powers, the forces that press upon mortal life, given divine shape and set loose among the descendants of the void. From Nyx came Thanatos, who is death, the still one, the ender who comes for every living thing in its appointed hour. From Nyx came Hypnos, who is sleep, the gentle brother of death, who lays his soft hand upon the eyes and carries the weary down into forgetfulness for a night, only to loose them again with the morning. And from Nyx came Eris, who is strife, the seed of quarrels, the discord that sets neighbor against neighbor and army against army. Death and sleep and strife were given a mother, and having a mother they had kin, and a house, and a standing among the powers. That was the Greek instinct with anything that pressed hard upon a life, to find its parents. So when a mortal lay down at the end of a long day and let the dark come over him, he was received by a god, the son of night, who had been given that office and did it faithfully. And when at last the longer sleep took him, the one that does not loose its hold, it was the brother of that same gentle power who bore him away. Sleep and death were made near of kin, born of the same darkness, and the small closing of the eyes each evening was understood as a faint and daily rehearsal of the greater closing that waits for all. Strife too was given her place in this family, and her presence among the children of night says something plain about how the old poets saw the world. Discord was not an accident that spoiled an otherwise perfect order. It was there from near the beginning, woven into the fabric of things before ever a mortal drew breath. And the old singers went further, for one of them insisted that Strife was not one goddess, but two who wore a single name. The elder is the cruel one who swells wars and quarrels and whom no man loves. The younger, set in the roots of the earth for the good of mortals, is the one who wakes a lazy man when he sees his neighbor's field ploughed early and his neighbor's granary filling, so that potter is stirred against potter and singer against singer, and the work of the world gets done. Strife, on that reckoning, was both the wound and the spur, and a life without her would not have been peaceful so much as idle. Now the story turns from the line of chaos to another source entirely, and here the ground itself begins to speak. Apart from the descendants of the void, all the remaining deities of the Greek reckoning arise from a single mighty figure, Gaia, who is the earth. She is broad and deep and sure, the firm floor beneath all standing things, the abiding seat on which gods and mortals alike would one day make their homes. And her first great works she accomplished entirely alone, without a partner, without any union, producing out of her own vast being the figures that would represent the great parts of the physical world. First among these self-produced children was Uranus, who is the sky, the starry vault that Gaia brought forth to cover herself on every side, so that there might be a sure and everlasting dwelling for the blessed gods to come. She made him her equal in breadth, spreading him above her from horizon to horizon, a canopy of dark and glittering reach. And she brought forth also Pontus, who is the sea, the barren and restless deep, the wide grey water without sweet union of love in its first making, called into being by the earth alone. So the earth set above herself the sky, and laid beside herself the sea, and in doing so she prepared the great stage on which everything after would unfold. Then came the turning that set the long genealogies into motion, the two great powers that Gaia had made from herself, the sky above and the sea beside, turned back toward the mother who had borne them, and mingled with her, so that the earth who had first created alone, now created in union. This is one of the deep, strange notes of the old cosmogony, that the first partners of Gaia were her own offspring, the sky and the sea she herself had shaped. From these unions, two great branches would spring, two lineages reaching outward from the single root of the earth, one flowing toward the water and the shore, the other rising toward the mountain and the throne. The watery branch came of the union of Gaia and Pontus, the earth and the sea. From their mingling came a lineage bound to the deep, a company of sea-associated powers who would people the waters with divinity. There were elder gods of the sea, kindly and truthful in the oldest telling, keepers of the salt water who knew its moods and its secrets, and did not lie to those who came to them. From this line would descend the gentle daughters of the deep, the many sea maidens who move through the green water and rise, on calm days, to sit upon the rocks where the spray cannot reach. The sea in the Greek imagination was a peopled country, crowded beneath its surface with watchers, thick with the children of earth and sea, so that a sailor, leaning over the side, looked down into a household as full as any on land. Yet the same union brought forth more than the fair and the kindly. Alongside the sea divinities came an assortment of monsters, strange and formidable forms that the deep seemed to hold in its darker places. The old genealogy does not flinch from setting the beautiful and the terrible side by side, born of the same parents, kindred in the same salt line. There were shapes of dread coiled in far caverns, creatures with many heads or serpent bodies, forms that later heroes would be sent to face at the edges of the known world. To the Greeks, this mixture felt true to the sea itself, which gives fish and safe passage and gentle nursing daughters, and which also swallows ships whole and hides things in its depths that no mortal was meant to look upon. The watery line held both, and both traced their descent from the earth and the barren deep. This was one of the two great roads leading out from Gaia, and it wandered ever toward the coast and the horizon, toward the tide and the strange forms below it. The other road climbed. It began where the earth lay beneath Uranus, the sky, in the union that would in time produce the rulers of the world. From the mingling of Gaia and Uranus came the family that would eventually give rise to the Olympians themselves, though many turns of the story lay between this first generation and the bright company on the summit. The chief of their children were the 12 Titans, the elder gods, 6 of them male and 6 of them female, a great and balanced company brought forth beneath the sheltering sky. In Hesiod's ordering, these 12 fall into a pattern that the eye can hold. 4 of them formed married pairs, male and female Titans wedded each to a sister, so that 4 of the brothers took 4 of the sisters as wives, and from these couplings the further generations would flow. Of the 2 remaining male Titans, each in time would wed a goddess from beyond the circle of his siblings, and the 2 remaining female Titans would come, in a later age, to couple with Zeus himself, so that even the youngest ruler of the gods would draw some of his children from the oldest stock. There was Oceanus, the deep-flowing river that circles the rim of the world, and Tethys his wife, and from the 2 of them descended the springs and the streams and the countless daughters of the water. There were Hyperion, whose name means the one who goes above, and Thea, and of their union were born Helios the sun, Selene the moon, and Eos the dawn, who reddens the edge of the sky before either of them appears. There were Coeus and Phoebe, from whom the gift of prophecy would run down through a daughter to the bright island of Delos. There was Creus, and there was Iapetus, whose sons were a house of extremes, one bold enough to steal fire out of heaven and carry it down for the sake of mortal men, another broad-shouldered and slow, who would be set at the western edge of the world with the weight of the whole sky standing on his neck. There were Themis, who is right custom standing upright, and Mnemosyne, who is memory and the mother of song, and these two would come at last to the bed of Zeus. There was Rhea, and there was the youngest brother of them all, a Titan, whose name would soon fall across the whole of the story like a long shadow, waiting among his elders for the part he would one day play. Even the name they carry has a bitter sound in the oldest telling. Hesiod says that it was their father who called them Titans, the straining ones, the ones who reached and overreached, and that he spoke the word not as a title of honor, but as a reproach flung at them for a great deed presumptuously done, promising that vengeance would follow after. So the elder gods went through the ages wearing a curse for a name, and the word that marked their strength also marked the moment their strength went too far. They were mighty enough to reign for an age and to be remembered forever, and their name kept inside itself the seed of their fall. So the earth, who began alone, had now set two great lineages moving beneath the sky she herself had raised, the watery line toward the deep and the elder line toward the throne. The Titans stood in their strength beneath their father Uranus, 12 powers of the first family, waiting in the shelter of the world. And yet the sky who covered them all was not a father content to let his children stand free in the light. The sky pressed close upon the earth in those first ages, and his nearness was not only the nearness of love. Uranus looked upon certain of the children that Gaia bore him, and what he saw filled him with a cold unease. For not all of their offspring wore the balanced shape of the Titans. Some were vast beyond reckoning, terrible in their forms, made on a scale that even the elder gods found hard to bear. 3 of them were the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones, each brother crowned with 50 heads and reaching out with 100 arms. A storm of limbs and watching faces gathered into a single towering body, and 3 of them were the Cyclopes, giants of great strength and skill, each bearing in the center of his forehead a single round eye that turned its gaze upon the world without a second beside it. These 6 were the strongest and strangest of the earth's children by the sky, and Uranus hated the sight of them. Some of the singers say that he loathed their monstrous forms, and some say that he feared their power, sensing in their limbs and their single eyes a strength that might one day rise against him. Whether it was disgust or dread, the sky resolved that they should never stand free in the light. As each of them was born, he pressed it back. He would not let them climb up, out of their mother, into the open air. Instead, he hid them away in the secret places of the earth, thrusting them down into the hollow depths of Gaia herself, so that her own body became their prison. The cruelty of it lay in where they were kept. Gaia was the earth, wide and enduring, the firm floor of all things. Her children were not carried away to some far dungeon beyond her reach. They were shut inside her, in the deep and lightless folds of her own being, and there they stayed, cramped and groaning, unable to rise. The Hecatoncheires with their 100 hands could find nothing to grasp. The Cyclopes with their single eyes could find nothing to see, and their mother felt every one of them, lodged within her like a swelling that would not ease, a constant inward ache in the dark beneath the mountains and the plains. Uranus took his pleasure in coming down to her, spreading himself across her from horizon to horizon, and in that very act he pressed the imprisoned children deeper still, so that his love and his cruelty were bound together in one motion. Here was the first wound in the order of things. Before this there had been separations and pairings, the void and the light, the sea and the sky, but there had not yet been this, a father who shut away his own children out of fear of what they were. Gaia had raised the sky to be her equal and her shelter, and the sky now used the very shelter of her body against the children she had borne. Her pain hardened over the slow turning of the ages into something with an edge to it. Grief became grievance, and grievance became resolve. The earth, who had brought forth so much in gladness, now brooded on a single thought, deep in her groaning depths, and out of that brooding, the first act of open violence in the cosmos would take its shape. Gaia did not strike in haste. She was ancient and patient, and she was cunning, and she set herself to make a thing that had never been made before. In the deep places of herself, she brought forth a grey and unyielding element, adamant, the hardest of all substances, a metal that no other force could break or blunt. From this she fashioned a great sickle, a curved blade with a wicked inner edge, forged for a single purpose and for no other. When it was finished, she did not carry it openly. She hid it away in a crevice within the stone of the mountain that would become the seat of the elder gods, and there, in the cold dark of the rock, the sickle waited, its edge keen and its shape hidden, ready for the hand that would dare to use it. Then Gaia gathered her Titan children about her, and she spoke to them of their father and of the brothers shut away inside her. She laid the whole grievance before them, the imprisonment, the pain, the long insult of it, and she asked them to act. She had made the blade, and she needed only one of the 12 to lift it against Uranus. But her words fell into a great silence. The Titans were mighty, and yet at the naming of the deed, a fear took hold of them, one by one. To strike at the sky was to strike at their own father, the ruler of all that was, and none among the 11 would put out a hand toward the hidden sickle. The mother stood before her strong children, and her strong children looked away. Only the youngest answered. Cronus, the last born of the 12 Titans, stepped forward where his elders had drawn back. Something in him was bolder than his brothers, or angrier, or more willing to seize what the others feared to touch. And he told his mother that he would do the thing she asked, and that he did not dread his father in the least. This gladdened the heart of great Gaia. She took him aside and set out the whole of the plan, and she placed in his hands the grey sickle she had forged. Then she showed him the crevice in the rock of Othris, and there she hid him away, folding him into the same secret dark that had held the blade, and she taught him where to wait and how to strike when the moment came. The sickle was no longer alone in the stone. Now a Titan crouched beside it, still and patient, his hand closed upon the adamant, listening for the coming of the sky. The moment came with the falling of the dark. Uranus descended as he was accustomed to descend, drawing the night around him, spreading himself once more across the body of the earth, longing for her and reaching to cover her from edge to edge. He did not know that within the mountain his own sun lay hidden. He did not see the crevice, nor the grey edge waiting inside it, nor the eyes fixed upon him out of the stone. As the sky settled close over the earth, Cronus reached out from his hiding place with his left hand, and with his right he took up the great sickle with its long, jagged teeth, and swiftly he cut. In one stroke he severed his father's genitals from his body and flung them away behind him, out and over the mountain, casting them far across the wide sea. The singers of old told this without dwelling on the horror of it, as men recount the turning of an age rather than a wound in a single body. What matters in their telling is not the blood, but the consequence. In that one stroke, the sky was torn from the earth. Uranus, in his agony, drew back and up and away, lifting himself high above the world and never again pressing down upon Gaia as he had before. The close and smothering nearness of the first days was ended. Sky and earth were parted for good, set at the distance where they have remained ever since, with the open air of the world held between them. And the rule of Uranus, the first sovereign of the cosmos, was broken in the same instant, for a king unmanned could not hold the throne of all things. He lost the kingdom in the very moment he lost the strength that had held it, and for the first time since there had been a world, the highest seat in it stood empty. What was to become of the fallen king himself was not settled that night. That waited upon the will of the sun standing over him, with the blade still wet in his hand. Yet the story does not let this ending be only an ending. What was cast away did not simply vanish into the sea. The severed flesh and the blood that fell from it carried the old creative power of the sky, and where they came to rest, that power stirred and brought forth new life. Some of the blood fell back upon Gaia, upon the earth, and sank into her, and from those drops she conceived and in time gave birth to further beings. From the drops of that blood came fearsome powers, avenging spirits and hard-armored warriors, and long-lived nymphs, born of the wound rather than of any glad union. And the genitals themselves, cast out across the water, drifted upon the waves for a long while, and a white foam gathered about the immortal flesh. Out of that foam, in the fullness of time, a goddess grew, rising at last upon the sea near the shores of an island, radiant and full-formed. In this way, the tradition explained how one of the great deities came into being not from the marriage bed of the gods, but from the very act that overthrew the first king. Out of this, the old poets drew one of the deep patterns they set at the root of their world. The first great violence did not close the door on creation, it opened new doors. Birth came out of wounding. From the same stroke that ended the reign of the sky, there sprang beings that had never been before, so that destruction and making were braided together and could not be pulled apart. The old singers did not present the fall of Uranus as pure loss. They made it a source, a wellspring, one of the strange and fertile places from which the ordered company of the gods slowly filled out and grew. Even the unmaking of the first king became, in their telling, a kind of begetting. While the foam still gathered on the far waves, the deed on Mount Othrys moved swiftly toward its harvest. Cronus stood now where his father had stood, the sickle red in his grip, the sky driven up and away, and the whole weight of rule fallen suddenly within his reach. His first act touched the very grievance that had begun the strife. He went down into the depths of Gaia, and he opened the way, and he freed the 6 imprisoned children, the 3 Hecatoncheires with their 100 hands, and the 3 Cyclopes with their single eyes, drawing them up out of the folds of the earth into which their father had thrust them. For a moment it must have seemed that the old wound would at last be healed, that the strong and monstrous children would walk free beneath the open sky, and that the reason for the whole deed had been fulfilled. It was not so. Cronus looked upon the freed giants, upon the storm of arms and the ring of watching heads, and the great single eyes, and the same unease that had gripped his father now gripped him. He would not have such powers loose in a world he meant to rule. So the son repeated the very crime he had risen to avenge. He seized the Hecatoncheires and the Cyclopes once more, and he cast them down, not back into their mother, but into Tartarus, the deep and dreadful pit that lies far below the surface of things, the lightless prison beneath the roots of earth and sea. Nor would he leave the maimed father even the freedom of his ruin. The starry vault stood where the blade had set it, high and cold and glittering above the fields of men. But the sovereign who had ruled out of it was taken and bound. Cronus carried his father down past the roots of the earth and the roots of the sea, past the bronze gate and the pit that lay behind it, and shut him away beneath Tartarus itself, under the very floor of that prison, so that the deepest dungeon of the world was found to have a cellar, and the first king of all things was laid in it. He who had once covered the whole earth from horizon to horizon was folded into a dark, narrower than any he had made for his own children, and no word of him came up again by any road that a god could walk. The children Gaia had hoped to free were shut in a colder and more distant prison than before. Their father was buried lower still, and their mother's grievance, which had seemed on the point of ending, was only carried down into a new and deeper place. Then Cronus took to himself the title that had been his father's. He named himself the ruler of the cosmos, the sovereign of all the gods and all the world, and he made his brother and sister Titans bow to his rule, so that the elder gods reigned upon Mount Othrys, with the youngest of their number set above them. Later ages remembered that reign strangely, and with a kind of longing, calling the mortals who lived beneath it the golden race, who took their food from ground that gave it unasked, who knew no toil that broke them, and no age that bent them, and who went at last into death as into sleep. The same poets who told of the pit beneath the world told also of that ease, and never troubled to reconcile the two. What is certain in the telling is the shape of the new court, a king who had come to the throne by a blade, and who therefore watched every hand that came near him, monstrous kin sealed in the dark beneath his feet, and a mother who remembered everything. What Cronus did not yet know, he was soon told. Gaia beneath his feet, and Uranus beneath even her, sealed under the floor of the pit, the two ancient parents who between them held all the knowledge of what had been and what would follow, sent word up to the new king. It rose out of the ground from two depths at once, a warning shaped like a sentence. For all his strength, he was fated to be overcome by his own son, and the throne he had taken from a father would be taken from him by a child. From that hour, the king's rule was a rule under watch. He had taken Rhea, his sister, to be his wife, and every birth that came of that marriage arrived as a threat rather than a joy. So Cronus devised the guard that has kept his name terrible ever since. As each child slipped from Rhea's knees, he took it up and swallowed it whole, alive and unhurt, drawing it down into his own body, where nothing could grow against him and nothing could be plotted. Hestia went down first, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. Because they were deathless, they did not perish there. They lived on inside their father, sealed in a darkness that was neither the pit nor the grave, waiting without hope in the belly of the king. 5 children, and no cradle in the house, and a mother who each time watched the same thing done. Rhea's grief hardened, as her mother's grief had hardened before her, and when the 6th child stirred in her, she sought out the only counsel older than her husband. She knelt to the ground, and she raised her face to the night, and she begged the earth beneath her and the sky above her for a way to save it. They sent her away in secret to the island of Crete, and there, in the dead of night, in a cave on a wooded mountainside, she bore Zeus and gave him over to the earth herself to nurse and hide. Then she went back to her husband, carrying a great stone wrapped round in swaddling bands, cradled in her arms as an infant is cradled, and she laid this in the hands of Cronus. He never looked. He took it up in his haste and swallowed it as he had swallowed the others, and he went away satisfied, believing the danger safely inside him, when what he had swallowed was only a weight of rock from the mountains of his mother. So the youngest son of Cronus grew in secret on Crete, while the king counted his children and found them all accounted for. Around the cradle moved a strange and vigilant company. The Curetes, armed dancers of the divine retinue, circled the hidden child and beat their spears against their shields, stamping and leaping in a clangor that drowned the sound of an infant's cry, so that no wail should rise up the slopes of the world and betray him to the ears of his father. Their dance was a shield made of noise, a wall of ringing bronze thrown up around the one who would inherit everything, and they kept it up season after season, sweating in their armor above a sleeping child. When his strength had come to its fullness, Zeus went up from the island to undo his father's guard. By the crafty counsel of Gaia, and in some tellings by a drug that a wise goddess mixed for the purpose, Cronus was made to give back what he had taken. He heaved up first the stone, which came out of him as it had gone in, and that stone Zeus set down at Pytho, beneath the slopes of Parnassus. Fixed in the ground, as a sign and a wonder for mortals to look upon in later ages. Then, one after another, and in the reverse of the order in which they had gone down, the swallowed children came back into the light, whole and immortal and full grown, for the years inside their father had not wasted them. Hestia, who had been swallowed first, came forth last, and so the tradition could call her both the eldest of that generation and the youngest. They rose out of the dark of the king's body into the open air, 5 deathless gods who had never seen the world they were born into, and they stood beside the brother who had freed them, and from that hour they were his allies against the father who had eaten them. By now the world had hardened into 2 great households set upon 2 great mountains, and between them lay the question that would decide the fate of all things. Upon Mount Othrys reigned the elder gods, the Titans, the children of Gaia and Uranus, with Cronus enthroned among them as their fearful king. They were the older generation, the first family to hold rule after the fall of the sky, and Othrys was their seat and their stronghold. Toward another mountain, the younger powers were gathering, drawn as if by the slow logic of the story itself, toward Mount Olympus, the height that would give its name to all who came to dwell upon it. The one company looked backward to the first ages of the cosmos. The other looked forward to a reign not yet begun. And the son who had been hidden on Crete, with his 5 disgorged brothers and sisters at his shoulder, was the hinge upon which the 2 would turn. So the great division of the cosmos deepened, slowly and without haste, into the terms of a coming conflict. It was a quarrel between kin, and it was a great deal more than that. A question set at the very center of the world, which the void of chaos and every generation since had carried unanswered toward this hour. Which generation would rule the universe? Would the elder gods of Othrys hold what they had seized, keeping the younger powers forever in the shadow of their fathers? Or would the ordering of all things pass into newer hands? Nor were the lines drawn as neatly as 2 mountains might suggest. Not every Titan stood with Cronus. The eldest of them, Oceanus, kept his slow circuit at the rim of the world and never came into the fighting at all, and there were daughters of the elder stock who carried counsel and warning down to the younger camp and were rewarded for it afterward. The war, when it came, would divide the first family against itself, brother from brother and daughter from father, and there was no god so far off or so old that the choosing could pass him by. That war the old singers named the Titanomachy, the Battle of the Titans, and they set its long unfolding in the land of Thessaly, in the plains and highlands that lay between the 2 mountains. There would be no ambush this time, no one hand and one blade waiting in the dark. On the one side stood most of the Titans, the older gods gathered about Othrys, defending the rule they had held since the fall of the sky. On the other stood the Olympians, Zeus and the 5 who had been drawn back out of their father, and with them the allies who cast their lot against the elder reign. Yet for all the strength ranged on either side, no single blow could bring the thing to an end, for these were deathless beings, and death was the one weapon that neither host could raise against the other. A mortal army is broken when enough of its men lie still upon the ground, but a Titan struck down rose again, and a fallen Olympian did not stay fallen. The war could not be won by killing, it could be won only by mastery, by one generation forcing the other so wholly down that it could never rise to strive again. For that reason the struggle stretched across 10 years, a span the singers named to signal not a season of raids, but an age of contention. Yet those years were not a mere waiting, two camps glaring across a plain and doing nothing. The mountains themselves became both weapon and wall. The elder gods hurled the strength of the first world down from Othrys, and the earth shuddered under the weight of powers contending, the rivers turning in their beds, and the standing forests laid flat by the passage of immense forms. Season followed season, with neither host gaining the ground it needed, the advantage swaying from height to height and slipping away again before it could be seized. The Greeks who told this tale understood it as the founding contest of their world, the labor out of which the settled order was at last born, and they returned to it again and again in their songs. The fullest surviving account of this war is again Hesiod's, set down in the Theogony among the other works of succession. Yet Hesiod was not the only voice to sing of it. The classical age knew a whole epic given over to the struggle, a poem called the Titanomachy, ascribed by some to a singer of Corinth, which is said to have begun with the elder gods as they were before their fall, and to have carried the fighting through at far greater length than the shorter telling allows. Of that poem there remain a title and a scattering of quoted lines, and those lines do not always keep step with the version that survived. One of them appears to set Aegeon, greatest of the 100-handed brothers, in the ranks of the Titans rather than at the side of Zeus, which would have placed the heaviest arms in the war on the bank of the river that lost. Whole turns of the story could evidently be told the other way round, and were in halls where the listeners knew no other shape for it. Through those 10 years, the balance did not truly turn until Zeus went down after the help that lay buried beneath the world. He remembered the strong and monstrous kin whom first Uranus and then Cronus had shut away, and he judged that the pit itself held the very allies who could break the long deadlock. So he descended into that lightless prison and loosed them, the 3 Cyclopes and the 300-handed ones, and he did not thrust them down again as his father had done, but raised them up into the light and set them at his side. In gratitude the Cyclopes, cunning at the forge, gave into his hands the thunder and the lightning and the blazing bolt, the weapon that would ever after be the mark of his kingship, and the 100-handed ones took their stand before the ranks of the Titans and tore 300 boulders from the mountains, hurling them all at once in a single darkening storm, so that the elder gods were buried beneath the rock and could not fight their way free. Then Zeus, grown now to his full power and no longer a secret upon a Cretan slope, led his brothers and sisters forward, and the long war that 10 years could not decide broke at last against Othrys and turned toward Olympus. So the younger gods overcame the elder, and the Olympians supplanted the Titans in the rule of all things. Cronus and those who had stood with him were cast down from the height they had held and bound in the depths of Tartarus, sealed behind gates of bronze in the same darkness that had once held the Cyclopes, and laid there by no more than the thickness of a floor above the farther he had himself carried down, so that the two fallen kings lay stacked in the dark in the order of their falling. One alone of the defeated was left standing, and that was the punishment. The broad-shouldered son of Epithets was set at the western limit of the world, with the sky upon his shoulders, holding apart forever the two that the sickle had parted, so that the elder race supplied both the prisoners of the new order and one of its pillars. Hesiod measures that descent for the ear, as a man measures a well by dropping a stone. An anvil of bronze, he says, would fall 9 days and 9 nights from heaven before it struck the earth, and 9 days and nights more from the earth before it came to rest on the floor of the pit. About the place runs a wall of bronze, and the roots of the earth and the roots of the sea grow down toward it, and night is poured around its throat in 3 folds. And at the gate, where the older kings had set no guard at all because they had never imagined anyone coming out, Zeus stationed the 100-handed ones as wardens, the very kin that 2 rulers before him had feared and buried. Here was the thing the new king did that neither of the old ones had thought to do. The strongest and strangest of the first family were not hidden away, but given office, kept in the daylight, trusted with the door, so that what every earlier throne had tried to bury now stood watch on behalf of the throne itself. With the war concluded, Zeus became the ruler of the gods, the third to hold the sovereignty that had passed from Uranus to Cronus and now to him, and under his hand the cosmos reached the state in which the Greeks believed it still to rest. Here, for the first time since chaos, the long chain held fast and turned no further. What had been seized was instead shared out, and the sharing was the true end of the war. The 3 brothers cast lots for the great divisions of the world, and the lots fell so that the wide heaven and the bright upper air came to Zeus, the grey and sounding sea to Poseidon, and the misty kingdom of the dead to Hades, while the earth and the heights of Olympus were left common ground to all 3. The other honours were parcelled out in their turn, this office to one god and that to another, until every quarter of the world had a keeper, and no power stood unassigned. An order held by agreement is steadier than an order held by fear, and it was upon that dividing, more than upon the thunderbolt, that the reign of Zeus came to rest. Even so, the pattern of sons unseating fathers did not simply run out of its own accord. The king ended it, and he ended it from inside. Warned in his turn by the ancient parents that Metis, the council goddess of the elder stock whom he had taken to wife, would bear first a daughter and then a son, mightier than his father, Zeus swallowed the mother before the child could be born, taking the wisdom and the danger together down into himself. What came of it was no rival but a daughter, Athena, who rose out of her father's own head full grown and armed. and a king who now carried counsel in his belly rather than merely on his throne. 3 sovereigns had answered the prophecy by burying what they feared beneath them. The 4th answered it by taking it in, and there the succession stopped, because there was no longer anywhere outside the king for a successor to be raised. At the heart of that household stood the First Olympians, the 5 who were the children of Cronus and Rhea, brothers and sisters born of the same parents and bound now by the war they had fought and won together. There was Zeus himself, the youngest, who had been hidden in the cave and who now sat as king. There was Poseidon, his brother, into whose keeping the restless power of the sea had come, and whose sign in the art of later ages was the 3-pronged trident. There was Hera, his sister, who would stand beside him as queen of the divine family. There was Demeter, sister to them both, whose care would turn upon the grain and the growing of the earth. And there was Hestia, quiet and steadfast, whose place was at the hearth, and whose fire, once kindled in a house or a city, was not to be let out. These 5 had shared one father and one mother, had shared the long night inside that father, and had shared the labor of the war against the Titans. Now they shared the fruit of it, the core of the new order, the innermost circle of the family that Zeus would head. Yet there was a 6th child of Cronus and Rhea, a brother to these 5, who is not counted among the 12 who dwelt upon Olympus. Hades was his name, and he was no lesser in birth than his brothers and sisters, sprung from the same parents and standing with them in the same generation. But when the lots were cast, the realm that fell to Hades was the underworld, the region of the dead that lies far from the bright height of Olympus. And because he dwelt apart, in that distant and shadowed kingdom, rather than in the shining house upon the mountain, he was not reckoned among the Olympians, though he was brother to their chief. Even his name was handled with care. Men were slow to speak it plainly, and turned aside to other words for him, calling him the Wealthy One, the Receiver of Many, the host who has never yet turned a guest from his door, since the riches that come up out of the ground, and the dead who go down into it, were understood to lie in the same hands. So one of the 6 was set forever, a little outside the family he was born into, present in the world, yet absent from the mountain, a brother to the gods of Olympus, who did not himself live among them. Around these first Olympians there gathered in time a 2nd generation, the children of Zeus, and it was they who filled out the household with the fullness of its many domains. There was Athena and there was Apollo, honored in later ages in more sanctuaries across the great cities than almost any other. There was Artemis and there was Ares. There was Hephaestus, the maker and worker of the forge. There was Hermes and there was Dionysus, the last to be received into the company, a god of the vine who came into the Greek world as a stranger comes into a house, and had to be let in before he could be honored. And there was Aphrodite, goddess of desire. These were the younger Olympians, the sons and daughters who came after the founding generation and took up between them the countless offices of a settled world, so that scarcely any part of mortal life lay outside the care of one god or another. The old singers, however, did not tell of this younger generation with a single untroubled voice. While most of these were named as the Children of Zeus, some of the greatest were claimed otherwise. Homer's poems give Aphrodite a father and a mother, Zeus and the goddess Dione of the elder stock, and show her fleeing wounded from a battlefield to weep in her mother's lap. Hesiod gives her no mother at all, only the salt water and the drifting foam and the flesh of a fallen sky, and makes her older by a whole generation than the king who was supposed to have fathered her. Of Hephaestus, too, it was told in some places that Hera bore him alone, conceived without a father in answer to a slight, so that the lame smith of heaven owed nothing to Zeus but the roof over his forge. Nothing in Greek worship worked to force such accounts into agreement. There was no single book that held the true descent, no order of priests empowered to fix a lineage and correct all others, no council that could bind one city to the version sung in its neighbor's marketplace. Authority sat in two places only, and neither of them reached far. It sat at the altar, where a god was served under the name and the parentage the local rite had always used, and it sat in the craft of the singer, whose telling stood or fell by whether it satisfied the ear and did honor to the powers it named. Each city sang the descent that raised highest the god it kept, for to name a deity's parents was to name that deity's standing, and no singer willingly lowered the god whose festival fed him. A man who traveled took up the descent he found when he arrived, sacrificed by the custom of the place, ate his portion of the meat, and carried his own version home again untroubled. Two neighboring valleys could hold two fathers for the same goddess for centuries together, and both be perfectly at peace, because what a worshipper owed a god was the right rite at the right season, not the right opinion about a marriage bed. The sharpest of these differences fell upon the 12th seat itself, for while the role of the household varied at its edges, the number 12 did not. In some tellings, the 12th place was given to Hestia, the quiet keeper of the hearth fire, who among certain peoples sat serene at the center of the divine household. In other tellings, that same place was given instead to Dionysus, the youngest to come among them, the god of the vine and of the wine-dark rapture. And where he was counted in, she was quietly counted out. The one made room for the other, and no dishonor was meant by it. A city that set Hestia at its heart did so because the hearth was the heart of every home, the fire that must never be allowed to die. A people that welcomed Dionysus did so because his gift ran warm in their festivals and loosened the tongues of the reverent. The hearth fire and the wine cup were both of them ways of gathering a household, and the 12th seat simply held whichever the city loved better. Nor was 12 the property of the Olympians alone. Across the Greek lands, there were many groupings of 12 gods gathered for this purpose or that, bound to this shrine or that festival, so that the sacred number itself was shared out among more assemblies than one. At Olympia, the 12 were said to be served at 6 altars, each altar shared between 2 deities set together as a pair, so that the whole company could be honored in a single circuit of the sanctuary. Elsewhere, men swore by the 12 as by a court that could not be deceived, calling the full number down upon an oath so that no power should be left out and offended by the omission. The Greeks loved the completeness of that count, the way 12 seemed to close a circle and leave nothing lacking as the year closes upon its 12 turnings of the moon, and they used it more than once and in more than one place, wherever a whole assembly needed a shape the mind could hold. From the stories told of the gods, it is a short and natural step to the places where they were served, for the worship of the gods took up ground as well as breath. Across the land there were set apart sacred enclosures, the temenae, plots of earth marked off from common use and given over wholly to a divine owner. Such a precinct was cut away from the ordinary world as a field is cut away by its boundary stones, and within its bounds the ground itself belonged to the god. There stood the altar, and often in time a temple to house the image of the deity, and the whole was usually given to a single god or goddess rather than shared among many. Most of these holy places were already long established by the 8th century before our era, so that when the poets whose verses survive were first singing, the sanctuaries were not new. Generations had already worn smooth the thresholds and blackened the altar stones with the smoke of offering. Not every god, however, was approached in the same posture, and the manner of the offering told plainly which kind of power was being addressed. For the gods of the bright height, the Olympians who dwelt upon the mountain and in the open air of the upper world, the sacrifice was laid upon an altar raised above the ground. The smoke of it climbed upward, rising into the sky toward the summit where those deities were believed to hold their court, and the worshipper stood upright and lifted his hands to the heavens. The direction of the whole act was upward, toward light and air and the shining ones above. This was the worship proper to the powers of day. But there were older and darker powers whose home lay not above but below, and to these the same upward gesture would have been meaningless, even wrong. The gods of the underworld, the chthonic powers such as Hades and Persephone, who ruled the deep realm of the dead, were reached by a worship that turned downward instead. For them, the offering was not set high upon a raised altar, but given into the earth itself. Sometimes it was poured into a bothros, a pit dug down into the ground, so that the libation and the blood sank away toward the kingdom beneath. Sometimes it was brought to a megaron, a sunken chamber built low, a hollow place opening toward the powers below, rather than lifting toward those above. The hour was different too, for these were rites of the evening and the night, rather than of the morning. The worshipper of these gods bent toward the ground, and what he gave went down into the dark to seek the lords of that far country. In the one case the smoke rose, in the other the gift descended. By the very shape of the rite, the raised altar and the opened pit, the Greeks marked the difference between the gods of the summit and the gods of the depth, and honored each according to the place it kept in the ordered cosmos. There was, besides the many precincts each given to its single god, a way of honoring the great company altogether, and this too left its mark upon the ground and in the record. In the city of Athens, in the latter half of the 6th century before our era, there was built an altar of the 12 gods, a single sacred place dedicated not to one deity, but to the whole gathered assembly of the 12. It is from about this time that the Dodekatheon, the worship of the 12 as one company, is first plainly attested, so that the grouping we have followed through the myth steps here into the daylight of cult and stone. The family that the singers had long described as gathered upon Olympus was now given a shared hearth in the very heart of a city, an altar where all 12 could be reverenced at once, and from which, in the Athenian reckoning, the roads of the land were measured out. Yet the number itself, the sacred 12, echoed in Greek worship from earlier than that altar. In the Homeric hymn to Hermes, in the tale of the cunning infant who was scarcely born before he was already devising, there is a moment when the young god makes a sacrifice and divides the portions into 12. The division into 12 pieces is not idle. It points toward 12 honored powers, and so the count sounds already in that early song. Later, in the first decades of the 5th century before our era, the poet Pindar speaks of the honoring of 12 gods at Olympia, at the great sanctuary in the western Peloponnese where the games were held. Across these scattered witnesses, an altar in Athens, a hymn to the trickster of the lyre, a line of Pindar naming the rite at Olympia, one can watch the 12 pass from story into shared and public worship, gathered and served as a single divine company by the cities of the Greeks. The great gods, moreover, did not move through myth and image alone. Around many of them there gathered lesser companions, retinues, and followers who belonged to their god, as the smaller stars belong to a constellation, and these attendant figures are part of the picture the Greeks kept of their deities. The most vivid of these followings was the one that moved with Dionysus. About him went the satyrs, half-wild spirits of the countryside, with the ears and tails of beasts, and the maenads, the women seized by his rapture, who danced in his train through the mountains and the wine-warm nights. Where Dionysus went, they went with him, a procession of revel and abandon, and in vase painting and in verse alike, the god is scarcely shown without them. They are the visible sign of what he was, the god who dissolved the ordinary bounds of the self in music and in wine. Others of the great gods had their own attendant spirits, chosen fittingly to their nature. About Aphrodite, the goddess of desire, moved Eros and Himeros, love and longing, the very forces she governed, given form as her companions, so that she never appeared without the powers of yearning close beside her. The Curites, who had once ringed the cradle on Crete, kept their place in the world long after the child they guarded had come to his throne, honored in the rites of the island as the dancers whose clashing bronze had preserved the king of the gods, their old measure repeated by mortal feet at the festivals. So each great power was given a court and a company of its own, and the divine world was crowded not only at its summit, but through all its lesser ranks. What manner of life these attendant spirits held was a matter the ancients themselves never settled. The nymphs, the maidens of spring and river and wooded hill, were sometimes called goddesses outright, and yet there lingered a doubt whether they were truly deathless or only very long of life. Some held that a nymph might in the end fade and die, though her span was so vast, so measured out across the ages, that she was as good as immortal beside the brief flicker of a mortal life. Some tied her life to the life of her tree or her spring, so that when the trunk fell or the water failed, she went out with it. Of the satyrs, too, it was uncertain whether they were immortal or not. These were the in-between beings, standing on the threshold between the deathless gods and the perishing race of men, neither fully the one nor fully the other, and nothing in their worship ever pressed the question to an answer, since one did not sacrifice to a nymph on the strength of her lifespan, but on the strength of the spring she kept. In that uncertainty they kept, perhaps, something truer to the shimmering half-seen quality of such spirits, glimpsed at the edge of a wood or the lip of a spring, and gone again before the eye could fix them. There is one more turn in the way the Greeks thought of their gods, and it reaches beyond the bounds of the Greek world altogether. For the Greeks did not, on the whole, suppose that their gods were theirs alone. When they travelled among other peoples and saw strange rites and heard unfamiliar names, they were inclined to believe that these foreign nations were revering the very same divine powers as themselves, only under other names and in other forms. A god was known first by his name, yet behind the name the Greek looked for the power, and where he found a foreign god who ruled the same domain, he was ready to say that here was one of his own gods wearing a stranger's title. So the pantheon was, in their eyes, in some measure, a thing that could be translated from tongue to tongue. This habit of mind can be watched at work in their writers. When Herodotus, the great inquirer, described the religion of the Egyptians, he did not for the most part leave their gods under their Egyptian names, but named them by their Greek counterparts, matching an Egyptian power to the Greek god he judged to hold the same office, and so explaining the unfamiliar worship of the Nile through the familiar figures of his own people. Later, when Greek writers looked upon the cults of Rome, they did the same. Dionysius of Halicarnassus and Plutarch, describing the rites and the gods of the Romans, set them down under Greek names, telling of Roman worship as though its deities were the Olympians in Latin dress. And the elder Pliny, a Roman himself, gave voice to the same conviction from the other side, speaking of the divine as though the many names of the nations were so many words for the same underlying powers, translatable one into another across the borders of language and people. Yet it would be too simple to say that Greek and Roman worship were merely the same thing under two sets of names. The Romans, when they took up Greek gods and Greek stories, did not simply copy them. They adapted, reshaped, and made the borrowed powers their own, joining them to gods and customs that were native to Italy and had their own long roots. The result was its own creation, close kin to the Greek, yet not identical with it, a distinct process of borrowing and remaking rather than a plain sameness. The god who crossed the sea from a Greek shore to a Roman altar arrived changed, wearing a new name, bound into new rites, colored by the older powers of the land that received him. And so the translation of the gods, real as it was in the minds of those who practiced it, was never quite the tidy exchange it seemed, but a slow reworking in which the deathless ones took on, in each new country, something of the country itself. Beneath all these written words, whether Greek or Roman, there lies a witness older than any of them, and it does not speak so much as show. Clay remembers. The painted vessels that survive from ancient hands sometimes reach back further than the earliest poems we can read, and where the written line falls silent, the fired surface still holds its image. Vase painting is its own kind of testimony, set down not in the measured syllables of the epic dialect, but in the turn of a brush around a curving belly of clay, and now and then it carries a scene into view long before any surviving verse names it. On the pottery of the 8th century before our era, the geometric ware banded with careful patterns, its figures reduced to lean silhouettes of dark against the pale ground. The old stories were already being shown. There are scenes drawn from the great cycle of epic, the wide body of tales that gathered about the war at Troy and the returns of its heroes. And there are the labors and wanderings of Heracles, the strong man whose deeds were beloved above almost all others. The potters and the painters knew these tales as surely as the singers did, and they set them upon the clay for eyes that already understood what they were seeing. A shape in silhouette, a lion, a bow, a raised club was enough, because the story stood behind it in every listener's memory. Then, around the year 600 before our era, there stood a famous object which the ancients themselves described, a chest of cedar wood, said to have belonged to Cypselus, adorned with worked figures of ivory and gold and cedar. Upon it, among many scenes, appeared the earliest known depiction in art of the personifications, those figures in which an idea or a force was given a face and a form and a name, so that night or strife or justice might be shown as a woman or a shape and not merely spoken of. Here the abstract was made visible, the unseen power given a body one could point to, and the makers of the chest set these figures among the heroes as though they belonged in the same company, which, to the Greek mind, they did. Yet even the oldest painted clay and the most ancient carved chest were latecomers beside the true origin of these tales, for the myths were carried first, not by hand, but by voice. They were propagated by mouth, sung and recited, and passed from singer to listener, and from one generation to the next, most likely by the singers of the Minoan and the Mycenaean peoples, reaching back into the 18th century before our era, ages before Hesiod took up his staff of laurel, or any potter banded a vessel with figures. Long before the letters were shaped that would fix the succession of the gods in ink, the succession lived in the throat, and the memory of men who chanted it in halls, now fallen and forgotten. The written word and the painted vessel are the last and most lasting stages of something far older, the settled residue of a river of song whose earlier waters have run away and left no trace but the shape they carved. Out of that long remembering came all the names we have followed, and near the end of the line of them stands a figure who belongs to both sides of the great divide at once. For among the crowded company of gods and heroes, there was one man, born of a mortal mother, who was said to have crossed the boundary that no other crossed, and to have taken up his dwelling upon the mountain of the gods themselves. His name was Heracles, the same whose labors the old potters loved to paint, and of him it was told that after his mortal life had run its course, he underwent an apotheosis, a passing over into the deathless state, and became a resident of Olympus, numbered at last among the immortals he had served. This was a rare thing, and its rarity is the whole of its meaning. The threshold that Ichor marks is not a wall that a mortal may climb by wanting to. Men were born to grow old, to fail, and to go down at last into the house of the dead, and the gods upon the mountain had no knowledge, from the inside, of what that was. The nymphs and the satyrs, of whom the old writers could not decide whether they died or endured, stood forever in the doorway, neither in nor out. But Heracles alone was carried through the doorway entirely, and set down on the far side of it, and even then the cities could not quite settle what had happened, for in some places he was given both kinds of honor on the same day. The hero's offering poured low into the ground, and the god's offering burned high upon a raised altar, as though the ritual itself were unwilling to choose. So he became a kind of bridge thrown across the gulf. Below him were the worshippers, the mortal men and women who raised their altars and poured their libations and looked up toward the mountain they could not climb. Above him were the gods, secure in their glory, who had never known death and could not imagine it in themselves. And between them, having stood on both shores, was the one who had begun as a man and ended as a god. The line itself held, unbroken and as deep as ever. Heracles was simply the one place along it where the crossing could be seen to have happened. The single lamp of hope held out to a mortal audience that the distance between the earth and the mountain was not in every case and forever uncrossable. And with him the telling comes round to what lay under everything and drew the whole succession forward. It was never truly a matter of who struck whom, nor of which mountain held which throne. It was this: how could a world so ordered, so bounded and lawful and sure of itself, have grown from a beginning that owned no bound and no law at all? Every birth the tale has followed, and every overthrow, was one long answer to that single wondering. Order, the Greeks were saying, was not handed to the world from somewhere outside it, for there was nothing outside it to do the handing. The world made its own order out of its own body, slowly and at cost, the way a family makes a house out of marriages and quarrels and long-remembered accounts. The calm upon the summit tonight is not the calm of a thing that was always so. It is the calm of a thing that was worked into being. And the form that answer took is worth marking, because they might have answered otherwise, and other peoples did. A first principle would have served the reasoning just as neatly. A law, or a number, or a cold, unmoving cause, and would have left nothing whatever to sing. What the Greeks set at the end of the long descent instead was a household, and they gave its history the way a farmer gives his own, whose child took what from whom, which marriage brought the olive terrace into the family, by what right of struggle a thing was held, and by whose default it was lost. Kinship was the grammar they had for power, and so the road from the boundless gap to the throne is not a chain of arguments, but a chain of births and displacements. A listener who could say who came of whom had said everything he needed to say about why the world stood as he found it. That the ruling powers wore faces so like his own was not a failure of imagination, but a kind of nerve, a refusal to leave what governs the world entirely strange. Let the figures who carried that road be named once more as the light goes down on them, each with the one thing that was his own. Chaos first, the gap that had no floor and no far side. Then Nyx the night, whose fold held death and sleep and strife. 3 children too grown to be carried, and never far from her. Then Gaia, broad and level and patient, who made the sky to cover her and the sea to lie along her flank. Then Uranus above her, glittering and far too close, until a grey edge came out of the mountain in the dark, and afterward, not above her at all, but carried down under the floor of the pit, the first of the kings, and the lowest laid of them. Then the 12 Titans beneath him, Oceanus turning slowly at the rim of the world and never leaving it, Hyperion, whose children are the sun and the moon and the red edge of morning, Themis, standing upright as a post set true, Mnemosyne holding everything that had ever been said. Among them Rhea, with a stone in swaddling bands held against her shoulder, and Cronus, youngest and boldest, whose hand closed in the rock upon the blade his mother forged. Then the children of Cronus and Rhea, who came up out of the dark of him into air they had never breathed. Hestia, beside a fire, fed at the same hour every evening for as long as the house has stood. Demeter, with the grain heavy in her hands. Hera in her authority, watching the door as a queen watches it. Poseidon, whose share came up out of the lot grey and sounding, and Zeus, brought down from a Cretan cave with the thunder new in his grip. Their brother Hades, in his own hall far below, where the offerings come down to him through the floor of the world, and no one says his name aloud. Then the younger gods, filling out the seats, Athena and Apollo, Artemis and Ares, Hephaestus at his forge with the coals raked down to embers, Hermes with the road dust still on him, Aphrodite risen out of white foam, and Dionysus at the edge of the light, the newest of them and the furthest travelled, with the vine still on him. Together they were the household of Olympus, held together less by any roster than by the mountain they shared and the Father who sat at their head. And there the long succession comes to its rest. The Adamantine Sickle was set down long ago, wherever the hand that carried it let it fall, and nothing has lifted it since. The gate below the pit stands shut, the 100-handed wardens quiet beside it, and no sound comes up through the bronze, neither from the elder gods behind it, nor from the older king who lies deeper than they do. The curates have stopped their dancing on the Cretan slope, and the cave stands empty and cool with the smell of old smoke in it. The plains of Thessaly are still, the 300 boulders settled deep into the fields where they fell, and grass has closed over them, and the sheep graze between them as though they had always been part of the ground. The earth and the sky keep the distance the blade set between them, and the space it opened is the air we breathe. Now let the mind loosen its hold, one image at a time. Imagine yourself turning away from the summit and going gently down, the marble path giving way to pine, the pine to grass, the light growing soft and ordinary again around you. Each step down takes a little of the story with it, the thunder and the quarrels growing fainter behind you until they are no louder than wind in a far valley. At the foot of the mountain, in your mind, close an invisible door upon the realm of the gods, and feel it move on silent hinges, sealing the whole of it away in calm and order. Then see a single candle before you, its flame steady in the darkness. With a slow, gentle breath, blow that candle out, and let the last curl of light fade into the night. Rest well, sleep deeply, and let the ancient stories carry you into the night.